Brexit was really like a gym pass in the sense that once you've left the EU, there's more you need to do. Yeah, we need to get fit and strong. I actually think that wherever I lived within the European Union, I'd be a Brexiteer in a sense. I'd want to have that independence. So I actually think there's a great argument to make that whatever size country you are, if you have your independence and have your control over destiny, you can actually do great things. For me, business has been really neglected subject in many ways. It actually does an awful lot of good in society. It provides jobs, it gives people opportunities, provides training, provides people a ladder to sort of climb up, and that needs to be extolled and talked about.
Welcome to The Insurgency with me, Steve Baker. It's the podcast brought to you by Glint, the app which enables you to own, save and spend real physical gold just about everywhere that MasterCard is accepted. And we have got a real treat for you, somebody who has established some of the most important campaigning infrastructure of the free market right, a man with immense influence behind the scenes on the life of our country and indeed huge influence very publicly over Brexit. Lord Matthew Elliott, welcome.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
I want to ask you the big question that some of our viewers will be asking from the off. Why did you do it?
Great question. For me, so taking back control, that's the obvious point why I did it. But actually underlying all of that, the common thread through all the different campaigns I've done have basically been increasing people's prosperity and increasing growth. And for me, I really felt that with Brexit, the UK outside of the EU had a better chance of economic growth, improving prosperity, improving living standards, having more jobs for people than it did inside the EU. And I still believe that to this day. So for me, taking back control's the sovereignty point's really, really important, but also prosperity is a key part of it.
So I think that will trigger some viewers of this, some rejoiners, won't they? Because they've been claiming we've lost crazy amounts of GDP over it. Whereas I look at the chart, which I'm sure we can bring up on the screen, the chart which shows we've been performing like a mid-ranking EU country. We've been outperforming Germany. You'd have to believe we would have performed like the United States of America if we'd stayed in the European Union. I don't think any of that's credible.
Some of these papers are literally unbelievable in the sense that they have what's called a doppelganger model. So they actually assume that we would have performed the same as basically a combination of the US and Estonia. Now, you and I know that had we had the low energy costs of the US and perhaps the sort of low tax and transparency of Estonia, perhaps we would have had 8%.
What, the best of all possible worlds?
Exactly. That would be great.
In a magic country that doesn't exist.
But sadly we don't. And as our mutual friend John Moynihan said, in that meantime, we're more like Edstonia than Estonia.
Well, that's very, very good.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting because we're seeing a resurgence in the kind of rejoiners, and they're pointing to all of these fantasy figures, whereas it seems like they seem to just constantly ignore the reality of what is actually happening in Europe.
Yeah, the data versus the models.
The data versus the models, but also what the European Union actually is, what the European countries are like. I mean, do you find that the Remainers and the rejoiners, from the referendum to now, they just have this kind of fantasy of what the European Union is like, which isn't actually the case?
They do very much so. And, they still think that it's going to deliver huge growth if we rejoin. It won't. Brexit was really like a gym pass in the sense that once you've left the EU, there's more you need to do. We need to get fit and strong. And that means actually bringing in, pro-growth, pro-prosperity policies to make sure that happens. And actually, if you look at different sectors of the economy, like, for example, the tech sector, that's a great example, where we've now got different regulations to the EU, because they've got the crazy sort of AI Act in the EU. That's one of the key reasons why the tech sector in the UK has grown so rapidly.
So what I'm hearing from you is not nationalism, but classical liberalism, like me. I think, you're going for this full freedom in order to reform and to have a freer society. That's
a good way of putting it. And in fact, I often ask myself the question, if I lived in a big state country, we are really now that situation, but there was a time when, for example, Denmark was a big state country compared to a sort of medium state country in the UK. If I was Danish, would I have been on the more sort of pro-European side of things, where, of course, we knew the Eurosceptics there tend to be on the left, seeing the EU as a sort of capitalist plot they didn't want to join and all that sort of stuff. I actually think that wherever I lived within the European Union, I'd be a Brexiteer in a sense. I'd want to have that independence. So I actually think there's a great argument to make that whatever size country you are, if you have your independence and have your control over destiny, you can actually do great things. You know, whether it's the Singapore's of this world, that's been a great example of that. Taiwan, another great example. Dubai, all these countries with the right rules and regulations in place, they grow and they're prosperous and great countries.
Do you know, I'd love for us to be Singapore.
Yes.
Not all of Singapore.
Well, I did vote for Brexit, wanting the UK, and campaign for Brexit, wanting the UK to become Singapore on terms.
Yeah,
That sadly has not happened.
The reason I say that is
But it could have, and it can still happen.
And we have the ability to decide that for
And
ourselves, you know.
if it doesn't happen, we'll default on the welfare state. I mean, that's all clear. So we better do something. But, I mean, Singapore's growth has been terrific, hasn't it, over the years? Yeah.
Yes,
exactly.
And it's a really important point that, you know, if you look at this in a historical context, when we joined the common market in the 70s, I think it was 9 member states at the time accounted for 35% of world GDP. Now the EU is 15% of world GDP and will very soon be 10% of world GDP. We need to be looking at the fast-growing parts of the world and have the links with those countries.
Yeah.
So
And
go on, Harry.
I think it's such a key point that, because the way in which we are treating the European Union and the way in which some people in our country, whether they're economists or tend to be of the left or some figures of the right, they treat the European Union as if it is the fastest growing bloc in the world.
It's not.
And it's not. It's simply not. It simply
It's
isn't.
weird, isn't it?
And
Yeah,
it's
they do.
because their model is simply technocratic government with some competent and some not very competent people overriding domestic concerns and domestic politicians who actually do have a better understanding of what the local populations need. So it's not a surprise that when you're implementing Regulation X that has to apply to farmers in southern Italy alongside farmers in rural France or rural Spain, that it doesn't apply particularly well to all of them and everyone is worse off as a result.
And I think the Ukraine war has actually exposed this in the sense that that's now been going longer than the First World War has.
Wow, I hadn't even realised that.
And yeah, it's longer than that. And we still haven't really, any country, significantly increased defence spending in any meaningful way. And the fact we haven't been able to do so shows that politicians and the public at large have put a greater priority on the welfare state rather than defence and haven't been able to manoeuvre to adopt a more sort of wartime stance.
I want to ask you how you began your journey to freedom, because actually, reflecting on it when we did the brief, I mean, I knew that you'd founded the TaxPayers Alliance. I knew you'd founded Big Brother Watch and the other things you've done. I know I'm forgetting things, but you did Business for Sterling, you were involved in?
Business of Britain, I was involved with the
Business for
European
Britain,
Foundation and all these different things. Yeah.
But yeah, your 1,000-page thing, I've waved it in the House of Commons, amazing. So you've done an amazing amount of work to fight for a free future. Where did it all begin?
It all goes back to really the sixth form and learning A-level economics using Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. And there's a great economics teacher, and of course he had a proper textbook as well, but he basically played us the different Free to Choose documentaries, and we read the book as well, and that sparked it all. And that meant that when I went to the LSE and met Alistair Heath at Freshers' Fair, and he was then the president of the Hayek Society there, we got to know Hayek a bit better, and that part of your political economy.
So it was
really
a great
started
teacher. It was a great teacher that set you on the journey. Are you still in touch with that teacher?
Very much so.
You
and
are?
he actually came to the launch of Prosperity Through Growth last year, the book I wrote with Art Laffer.
Let's give him a shout out. What's his name?
Terry Ellsworth.
Well, Terry Ellsworth, well done. Because thanks to your inspiration, this great man has made a huge contribution to the life of our nation in the direction of freedom. So what an amazing story, and a very personal story. I wonder what we could do to get more teachers to teach Hayek and Friedman at school.
Well, I mean, even at school, at universities, I remember when I was at the Cambridge Judge Business School, and part of course I read politics, but and then formally read economics as part of being at the Judge Business School, and Hayekian economics was considered for about 1/4 of one lecture in the same brand of here are some crazy alternative theories, here is Marxism, and here is Hayek. And I could not believe that that was the way the great Hayek was being taught to university students. And then was surprised why we have so many young economists with just the wrong ideas, simply.
Yeah.
So what more can we do to have more free market thought in universities, in schools? What do you think?
Well, I think if we could do anything, I think actually concentrating on younger people at university is really, really key. And I actually think that's where people actually get most bang for the buck in terms of investing in the future. You know, when I think back to my time at LSE and when I was running the Hayek Society, the donations I got of, a few £100 and the support I got in kind of lending rooms and that sort of thing at the time was just so valuable to me, sort of setting up all the different campaigns and that sort of thing there. that's where we really need to invest in our sort of future.
Yeah.
Let's turn to your campaigning style.
Sure.
Because you are an amazing strategist. Walk us through what your, as it were, theory of change is. How do you set these campaigns up? What's the formula that you apply to come up with a successful campaign?
Well, the key point is it's got to be an issue I believe in. So I'm not just a sort of somebody for hire. I believe in all of these issues, and that's why that gives you the drive, the determination to set them up.
Yeah.
And that's really important because, as anybody will know, with a startup company, for example, you have to really push through some difficult times at the beginning to actually make these things get off the ground. That's really important.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's sort of basically the 3 M's. You need the right message, one that will actually resonate with people, which may not actually be precisely why you believe in it.
Mm-hmm.
It may be one which actually chimes with a larger electorate or the decision makers at large, parliamentarians, civil servants, but a message that actually sort of drive through that change. It's really important to get that right. The right messengers are so important as well. Now, as we know with the Vote Leave, what was crucial with the swing voters there was that many of them didn't want to feel they were voting for Nigel Farage and UKIP by voting Leave.
Yeah.
And that's why it was so important to have the likes of Boris Johnson and Giza Stewart and Michael Gove there championing the cause for us and many others. That was really, really important. So the right messenger is really important.
Mm.
And then, of course, it's the medium of communication, how you get through to people. And, that's changed so much over the years. When I first did the European Foundation as an intern during university, that was all about, with Bill Cash, great Bill Cash.
Yeah, of course.
That was all about basically the European Journal and stuffing it into envelopes, and job I did, and posting it out and sending out fax, press releases by fax to journalists. That's the time. And
so you and I can both fondly remember those days, but Harry's looking at us like we're aliens.
I don't think I've ever seen a fax machine operate before. I've seen them like there.
in films. But that's how things are done.
You're 2 years younger than me, I think. You're 48, aren't you?
Yeah.
And I'm 55 just. But when I first started at work, we had computers, but they weren't connected together. It's incredible. We actually were still sending paper memos. So campaigning's changed immensely over the years. Well, you mentioned about business founders.
Yeah.
And something remarkable about what you've set up is that it's endured. Big Brother Watch has endured despite you moving on. TaxPayers Alliance is one of the preeminent campaigning organisations in the UK. What's the secret to setting something up that can endure beyond the founder moving to something else?
Getting good people involved early on. And with the TaxPayers Alliance in particular, John O'Connell, who's been the CEO now for, I think, almost longer than I was CEO, which says a lot. Mm-hmm. He came on board as an intern, researcher, research director, CEO, and did a fantastic job.
Here at Fighting for a Free Future, we are proud to be associated with GlintPay. It's an app which enables you to own real physical gold, owned by you, secured in a vault in Switzerland, audited and belonging to you. And crucially, for those of us of ordinary means, it's gold that you can spend, if you need to, just about everywhere that MasterCard is accepted. So if you'd like to put yourself with some of what you own onto your own personal gold standard, please visit glintpay.com today. You're like the godfather of these things, Al. What else have you done? I mentioned the two big ones.
So basically, TaxPayers Alliance, Big Brother Watch, NOtoAV.
That was huge.
I did the Million Jobs campaign, which I did it off the grid a little bit, but I did that. Business of Britain, Vote Leave, Brexit Central, and now Jobs for Nation.
Yeah, it's huge. So let's just drill in on to NOtoAV.
Yeah.
I think you turned round a considerable majority for electoral reform into a considerable majority against. What was the secret to that campaign?
2 keys. First one was the right message. And at the time, this was Conservative Party just come in coalition with the Lib Dems, of course.
Yeah.
And it was the time of, should we say, so-called austerity. We could have a long discussion about that, but let's say so-called austerity.
Pain, but without the gain, unfortunately.
So people were concerned about the finance at the time, and there was a feeling that why on earth are we sort of spending all of this money on changing the electoral system when there are so many other priorities for the country? And that, in many ways, was the origin of the 350 million figure for the NHS on the bus. So that was the message we knew worked really well. rather than going to the complexities about different electoral systems and the pros and cons of each and that
cost
sort of
of it,
thing. So that was really important. And just very, very quickly, the right coalition as well. So we knew, broadly speaking, that eventually the Conservative Party would likely be on side en masse, to a bit of shoving, but they got there in the end. But getting 2/3 of Labour MPs and peers to be on side meant that we basically had the two main blocks with us. Sorry.
Yeah, no, well, we're about to probably have this argument again because Andy Burnham has strongly suggested, and his allies have strongly suggested, that Labour are quite likely to include PR in their next manifesto and particularly promise it without a referendum. I mean, what are your thoughts on the way in which our electoral system and our politics would evolve if that were to happen?
I'm a big believer in first past the post, because I much rather have the coalitions forming before an election rather than after. I think that's much better for accountability. So I'm very relaxed with a Conservative Party that's a broad church, where we can disagree with one another in an agreeable way, but basically unite around a manifesto. I think that's much better than having lots of little individual parties who then go into smoke-filled rooms after the general election and try and sort of cobble together a manifesto for government. That's not accountable.
Yeah, the voters should get what they wanted, or rather get what at least a plurality of them voted for.
Yes.
To be clear when you go in and vote what you're getting. So, I find myself thinking, are we winning? And you mentioned the austerity that really wasn't, and we can think about the trajectory of the public finances. Lord John Moynihan's written this brilliant book, Return to Growth, which sets out the sheer scale of the pension liabilities, both state and public sector, which actually dwarf our already astronomical national debt. It's a bleak picture. We've talked before. Don't need to go through it all, but people can get the papers. We'll link to them with the video to show that we are headed for bankruptcy and default on the welfare state. So I find myself thinking, despite all these amazing successes, it doesn't feel like we're winning this fight for freedom and prosperity. It feels like the left have been able to basically engage in vibe politics, which have grown the size of the state and its obligations. And I'm not sure we're winning. Are we winning? Where are we winning?
Where I take comfort is the fact that how much worse would things be were things like the TPA not to exist.
Yeah.
And the number of times where internal memos from the civil service have said, what would the TPA think of this? So basically, it does hold it back to a certain extent. It's a certain check on spending. So how much worse could things be? And
I see it's trips to the Maldives. Too many trips to the Maldives is out there for the TPA. That's incredible. What are they doing going to the Maldives so often?
So there's all that. And also, with Brexit, what would have happened had we stayed in? Now, there have been 14,000 regulations since that point. That'd be 14,000 extra bits of red tape. The membership fee would now be something like £28 billion a year. So we're not paying that membership fee. That's a crucial point. But also, one of our themes, not just a slogan, was basically how Brexit was a safer option. What would have happened had we stayed in the EU? I've got a feeling that actually the UK would have had to sort of start joining everything. Euro, Schengen area, all these different things.
They refused to change the treaty for David Cameron, didn't they? Yeah. The currency of the European Union is the euro, and that was not going to change just because we had not to.
Yeah. And I would add to that, I mean, one of the reasons I voted for Brexit, largely on sovereignty grounds, as I mentioned earlier, because I did want us to become Singapore on Thames. But one of the big reasons, one of my big arguments for voting and campaigning for leave was that one more Eurozone crisis and the EU will completely collapse. And it is a lot better that we had sorted out our position in relation to the EU now than in that case. And all you have to do is look at the economies, particularly of the poorer European countries, to see a Eurozone crisis is probably going to come, and it's probably going to come a lot sooner than people expect. And that's going to be an absolute disaster.
And with COVID, the EU's now taken on debt, hasn't it?
Yes.
So whereas it didn't before. And that's a key change. And that debt itself will grow.
We had to say to people, if you don't want to go to the destination, you've got to get off the train.
Yes.
And sure enough, it's continued. Okay, so an unfinished task. Did the politicians who inherited Brexit share our vision for what needed to be done?
Well, Theresa May definitely didn't. And we can let's leave the leadership election to one side. But she definitely didn't. She was somebody who misunderstood Brexit, sort of been all about migration, essentially, and therefore came out with checkers and being a sort of rule taker rather than rule maker, all that sort of stuff. So she definitely didn't. I would argue that Boris Johnson did. And in the interview I did with him for Prosperity Through Growth last year, he was talking about how he'd hoped that once we'd left in January 2020, with all that momentum, with the victory in 2019 general election, just leaving the EU, majority of 80, all that sort of stuff. He could have implemented a sort of big vision for Brexit and wanted almost like a Lawsonian style sort of free market resurgence within the UK.
Yeah.
And of course that didn't happen. And we could go do another full podcast on why it didn't happen.
Yeah.
The number one thing would be COVID.
And that just dominated.
List.
The state was completely overrun with coping with COVID, wasn't
Yes.
it? All our lives were, I think all of our lives were touched far more heavily by COVID than they were by Brexit. And that's shown again in the GDP figures.
But I mean, Brexit also benefited our response to COVID. We know we wouldn't have had such a quick vaccine rollout response if it wasn't for if it wasn't for Brexit. And I think one of the interesting things, I think I agree with you largely that Theresa May's vision of Brexit was exactly what a Remainer pictures a Brexiteer as.
Correct.
It was exactly that. All they care about is immigration. When actually, I don't think
it's a completely wrong parody.
Completely wrong. I don't think any of us would name immigration in our top 3 reasons at all for voting for Brexit, or campaigning for Brexit. But I think Boris did have some of that vision, but I think he often, him describing himself as I want to be a Brexity Heseltine didn't necessarily chime well with my.
Yeah.
But he did have a sense, I feel, as Mayor of London, that he was in charge of a sort of capital city where business played an important part in terms of being at the heart of the London as a vibrant city. And didn't he at one point sort of boast about the number of billionaires in London? So I think he got that.
Yeah.
He is not an economist by training, is he? So he's not going to express things like we express things. But I think at his heart, he's a free marketer. Certainly, he's talked about how he wanted to deregulate and rip up planning rules and this sort of thing. So in his own way, I think he got it.
I remember how I came to convene, let's not say lead, but convene the Conservatives. It's because you asked me to do it. You and Dan Hannan sat me down and said, would I do Conservatives for Britain? So thank you very much. More of a challenge than a gift. But I only had a kind of spectator seat for the great battles. You were the ringmaster who had to try and convene these different tribes. Can you just talk us through who were the really important tribes that you had to convene, particularly in the Conservative Party or on the centre right, because you also had to cope with the left as well. But who were the really important tribes that you had to work with?
So I talk about this in 10 Years On, and I basically boil it down to 3 tribes on the centre right. The first one was UKIP, Nigel Farage, Leave It to You, that sort of gang. And, hardcore Eurosceptics outside the Conservative Party with a big focus on migration a lot of the time as the key issue.
Yeah.
Then the second tribe was basically the free market Brexiteers within the Conservative Party. Dan Hannan, Douglas Carswell, and others. That was the other tribe, true believers, really important issue to them. Voting against the whip on countless occasions, championing the cause when it was unpopular, all that sort of stuff. Then you had the Conservatives who were basically, Brexit wasn't their number one issue. It doesn't need to be, but it wasn't for them. They were, climbing the career ladder in many ways. And for those people, I'm not going to sort of name names on that point, but we know who they are. That's a tribe there. And I would say there's a sort of key difference between the sort of 2 tribes within the Tory side. The free marketers, generally speaking, thinking that, government doesn't always know best. And those who are more the career side of things, slightly more technocratic, thinking that, having a very good theory of why things are going wrong within the state context and a good critique of the civil service. But often thinking that just the right people within it will make a huge difference and everything will improve.
It sounds a bit like my critique of Dominic Cummings, because the first time I came across Dominic Cummings, he seemed to be advocating the sort of curse of Plato, that if only we could find the right philosopher kings. Is that where Dominic is, do you think?
If you read his stuff, that's basically where he is, yes. Yeah.
No, it's very interesting, because I'm free market classical liberal, as are we all. And you do think that, or you do wonder why people like Dominic Cummings, who are so unbelievably intelligent, such an amazing campaigner, cannot also see the fact that the issue is that we have a big state. The issue is not who is in charge of it. The issue is that it's simply overcommitted. It doesn't work whoever you put in charge of it. And I will always say this, and this is one of the things that really disappoints me, because I don't think Dominic Cummings has reflected on his time in government particularly well and at all changed his views. he was at one point the second most powerful man in the UK to Boris. He was the second. When he was the chief of staff of the Prime Minister, he was the second most powerful man in the UK. And if you are the second most powerful man in the UK and you somehow cannot make a difference, maybe at that point you should reflect on some of your core views. But on that point of kind of reflection, would you say you have any regrets? Since the referendum, obviously you played such a core part in securing the victory. But since then, do you think you have any regrets about the way Brexit has gone or anything along those lines?
That's a good question. I would point to two. I think immediately after the vote, I think we should have been out there more making the case for Brexit. So that weekend, in particular, and the week afterwards, of course, things diverted straight into sort of Tory leadership election and psychodrama there. So being out there and making the case for Brexit and talking about how it's a good thing and the positive vision and having Geezer out there were doing fantastic. That would have made a big difference, I think. But also, as the votes went through, was it Meaningful Vote 3? That was the key one in about February 2019.
I'm trying to expunge it from my mind. I've got it all on my phone. But
it was
awful.
that time, wasn't it? It was sort of
by the time it was deep down after Chequers, and we'd fought hard to overturn Chequers, and then Theresa May made us vote the third time. And there were only 28 Conservatives.
Yeah, and at the time I was sort of battling the Electoral Commission still, and all going through all that sort of phase of things. By that point, it was basically down to the true believers, and I think some people like myself. I think Dominic said as well that they should vote for MV3. Some of the politicians who we all know and love very much did as well at that point. Perhaps all of us thought that this could mean the end of Brexit if we didn't actually go for this. So better have sort of cup half full than nothing. But actually, the vision that you had and the sort of determination that you and the Spartans had in fighting through that moment and basically making sure we didn't go for Brexit in name only. Yeah. And then ultimately sort of bringing down Theresa May, European election, what have you. That was crucial. We could have thrown it all away at that point.
I appreciate you saying so. Yeah. Thank you. Right. Oh, I've got to ask you about Nigel, because there he is. He's been riding high in the polls for a while. Makerfield's slightly upset that for a moment. We did work quite hard to keep him away from the campaign and have him to one side. And I think that was crucial to winning because of the swing voters. Do you share that view?
I do. So if you look at the swing voters in the centre, about a third of the electorate, roughly speaking, they were more Eurosceptic inclined, but they had issues with the economy and they were worried about the economy. So that's why groups like Business of Britain were so important in explaining all of that.
Yeah.
And also they didn't want to feel they were voting for Nigel Farage or UKIP by voting Leave. That was crucial. And they wanted to hear from people who hadn't yet made up their mind. That's why people like Boris coming out as being for Leave, Michael Gove, Gisela Stewart, were so important to winning those people over. So, yes, I think it was a good thing he wasn't part of the campaign.
But do you think it's fair to say that we wouldn't have Brexit without Nigel either?
I think there are a whole group of people who brought about the referendum, and you'd have to say people like Douglas Carswell as well, in sort of defecting from the Tories to UKIP. Bill Cash, all his campaigning over the years. Yeah. Jimmy Goldsmith. Let's go back to Jimmy Goldsmith. They're basically saying, forcing Blair to concede having referendum party. So going back to that point, really important point in fact, because going back to this was 1995 sort of thing, forcing Tony Blair to say he wouldn't go into the euro without a referendum, set that precedent that were there to be some huge change in our relationship, there'd be some referendum. That was really, really important. And of course, Nigel Farage is part of that mix. And to his credit, he became a Brexiteer sort of around the time of Maastricht, so way back in sort of early 90s. Margaret Thatcher just gone. And he had a decade plus of campaigning completely below the radar, unknown, going to small village halls, town halls across the country and pushing out the case. And you've got to take your hat off to him for actually being committed for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was in the Royal Air Force when Maastricht went through. I'd just left university and I was in the Royal Air Force and I wondered what all the fuss was about. Now I understand it, but let's move on. Because it seems to me that we have faced an absolutely relentless campaign of public demoralisation, particularly centred on the economics. I think it's very interesting that you are making the economic case, which, by the way, I think is right. I think unless we deregulate in ways which are not possible within the European Union, we will not grow in the ways that, for example, the United States does. in order to meet the pledges of the welfare state and have growth return to people's lives so they can be happy, prosperous and free. So I'm absolutely determined about what we need to do. But it does feel to me that it's going straight into the territory where those who've been demoralising the public now for 10 years, that's the territory they want to be, is the economy. Look how bad it all is. Is it the right territory to be fighting on? Is it essential territory? Do we have to do it and just take them on?
I think it's essential. And I think too long the right have been very, very focused on culture wars, which is an important debate, and I'm not dismissing it, but there was that period, quite sort of dark few years in a sense, when essentially all Conservatives were sort of big government Conservatives, and that was the way forward, and everyone was talking about this, and that was the only way, and those are the bleakest moments in a sense.
Yeah.
Now, at least, there are people out there making the case, and it has to be said that Kemi Badenoch's been very good on this, on the economy for the past sort of year or so. So I think that's actually starting to shine a light on these issues about debt and further room for improvement from all the parties, but at least these issues being talked about.
I couldn't say now whether Nigel Farage will head towards the free market or the state, given the way his electoral coalition is quite different from the Conservative electoral coalition. Have you got any sense of where Nigel would go? I think we know his historic instincts were Thatcherite. But...
Yeah, I mean, he spent most of his career as a Thatcherite free marketeer, and it feels like maybe the past 4 or 5 years he's just started to really throw that away.
So he said some good things recently about the role of small businesses, which I picked up on with my current role.
Yeah.
He's also done some good speeches about the need for deregulation, making the most of Brexit powers. And I'm not involved in any of this from what I read in newspapers. He is talking to some good people about a plan for government. So when he sort of gets in there, if he gets in there, he's able to make the most of Brexit and, get the economy going and that sort of thing. But there's been less detail, should we say, out there than other parties.
I do wonder, though, and I would love your thoughts on it. Do you think that Nigel sees Brexit as the making of himself, or do you think he sees himself as having that final act as Prime Minister?
I think Brexit was his most important battle that drove him. But now I think he wants to reshape the right. That's his driving force.
So let's come to what you're doing now.
Yes.
Jobs Foundation. It sounds like a very, very positive thing you're doing.
So slightly unusually for me, it's a charity, and it's a charity that talks about the role of business and society as being a force for good, particularly for the jobs and the opportunities it provides people. And this has been a passion of mine for a long time about how do you make the case for business. And for me, business has been really neglected as a subject in many ways, and actually does an awful lot of good in society just being itself. And what does it do?
Yeah.
It provides jobs, it gives people opportunities, it provides training, provides people a ladder to sort of climb up. And that needs to be extolled and talked about. And crucially, as well, if you believe in that, then you need to think, well, how do you make businesses thrive? And certainly, increasing employers' NI hasn't helped. Allowing the minimum wage to sort of drift up beyond what we can really afford, bringing in things like the Employment Rights Act, which has really actually made things very difficult for taking on trainees and that sort of thing, and first jobbers. That's really destroyed things. And more generally, having an anti-business environment, doesn't allow those businesses to thrive. So really, if we want to have a prosperous country, and if we want to have a country where people can climb right to the top and, have a great living and become prosperous themselves, we need businesses to be doing well. And that requires a good sort of free market, free enterprise environment.
I think this running theme I see throughout all of this is kind of hope. This hope for a better future, this hope for prosperity. How do we translate that to the public? Because it really feels like the public just doesn't have that hope anymore, that the future will be or can be better.
That's a really good point. I hope I do it in a small way through the campaigns. With all of these campaigns, though, it's a matter of the stars aligning for timing. And I think that with the Brexit, of course, we got that with David Cameron getting his majority in 2015. So it was game on for the referendum, and then it all happened. So from that point forward, I see a similar thing happening with the economy in the sense that now we're getting to a stage where even the likes of, dare I say, sort of Tony Blair in his essay about a month ago was saying that, the state is now too big and the tax is too high and we need to be, forgetting about rejoining the EU, we need to be embracing AI. there are people who are unusual bedfellows to us who are saying very, very similar things to come to the same conclusions. So I think that tipping point is happening, that we could actually get some real change.
Well, Matthew, very, very good. Now, what couple of things would you have the free market right do in order to advance our cause? What couple of things are missing that we could add to the movement for freedom?
It's a good question. Well, I talked about younger people before. I think it's a really important point. And I do my fair share of going around universities and speaking there and talking to people. But I think seeding more sort of Hayek societies across the country, free market societies, I think would be great in terms of advancing things. Because I think that everybody, young or old, they're slightly moving away from old school political parties and actually like embracing movements. So having that sort of freedom movement well represented on campus, I think is really important.
Well, Lord Matthew Elliott of Mickle Fell, thank you very much indeed for coming on the podcast. And if I may say so, thank you for all that you've done over the years to fight for a free future. I mean, we really appreciate it. You've been an inspiration to many of us.
Thanks, Steve.
And I really appreciate what you've done.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So this has been The Insurgency with me, Steve Baker, brought to you by Glint, the app which enables you to own, save and spend real physical gold. So if you go to glintpay.com, download the app, you too can get started today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and share and recommend to your friends.